starten. Ja, lass uns starten. Gut. Hallo zusammen, schön, dass ihr gekommen seid. Das freut uns sehr von der Bewegung für den Sozialismus. Die Veranstaltung wird auf Englisch sein. Das heißt, wir haben eine deutsch-simultane Übersetzung. Wenn jemand diese benötigen würde, dann gibt es dort hinten Geräte, die kann man beziehen gegen einen Personalausweis oder was Ähnliches als Pfand und kriegt man dann zurück. Braucht irgendjemand sowas? Perfect, so let's just dive into it. Good, so welcome everybody to our panel discussion about Ukraine or solidarity with the Ukrainian people. So as for how it's going to work, it's going to be a panel discussion. It's going to take time until 8:30. Then we're having a small break. Afterwards, we will conclude the panel discussion, and at the end, you will of course get time to ask our panelists questions. As usually, I ask everyone for the whole thing, the questions then, and the talk now, to be respectful. Yes, once again, thank you for being here. I guess we all know what brings us here. It's a very sad reason, actually. It's the second anniversary of the Russian regime brutal and full-scale invasion. There have been several 10,000 deaths, since 2022 alone. Some say there is 20,000 civilians, but nobody in Ukraine has really chosen the war, so we would have to speak of about more than 100,000 murder victims of the Putin system. So it's really a mass murder invasion that is dragging on for 2 years now already. 11 million people have been displaced within and outside of Ukraine. That makes it the biggest European refugee movement since the Second World War. Also the biggest European war since the Second World War, so really a historical watershed. And at the same time, we see that there is a regime in Russia, and even the president at its core, that is waging a propaganda campaign to present himself and the system as a misunderstood peacekeeper. Misunderstood Putin is a word that even Swiss magazines like Weltwoche, for instance, is using constantly again and again and again. While at the same time, the exact same Russian authoritarian regime is about to conquer or to try to conquer Kharkiv and other Ukrainian territories. Against this background, we would like to shed some insight on what's going on in the interior of Ukraine. How are people living under the war? Are they waging other social struggles simultaneously to that against their own government, for instance? And above all, we want to talk about the imperialist plunder of the Kremlin dictatorship with which Ukrainians are faced and confronted daily. So I'd like to welcome our guests from Ukraine. First, I'd like to welcome, I hope I'm saying this right, Alenka Gulenak. Good, thank you. She's a member of the Solidarität, a democratic socialist Ukrainian organization, and she's also an author for the left-wing Ukrainian magazines Commons. Is that correct? Yeah. Huh? And editorial. Ooh. And thank you for being here. And also, we'd like to extend our thank yous to Tasha Lomonosova. She is also a member of the Solidarität, and she's also working for the think tank SEDOS, where she's doing some research on social problems in Ukraine. Good. So with this in mind, I'd like to start right away and dive into the questions. So first to you, Tasha. You have been working on social policy, labor problems, labor migration, and other social problems in Ukraine. Now, how are everyday lives affected by the war in terms of personal experience? How does the ongoing war affect the civilian population?
Okay, so I think I will start just with some maybe very general information, but also it's the 2 years of war, and I think it's important to underline like some the worst aspect of the war that we experience as civilians in Ukraine. So you have already mentioned the greatest problem is personal security, because the war is happening everywhere and many Ukrainian cities get shelled. So there's a lot of problems with security because of the inadequate amount of bomb shelters. Many shelters are not physically accessible for people with disabilities and for elderly people, and unfortunately the evacuation which have been organized, especially in the first year of the war, wasn't also really, let's say, organized in the best way how it could be organized. So the safety is the greatest problem, of course, but the war comes with the economic consequences of it, and currently the level of unemployment is quite high. Officially, like it's 17%, but it's only estimations because it's very hard to make this, official statistics, and also all the data that we have is only about the controlled part of the Ukraine, controlled by Ukrainian government. So yeah, the unemployment is high, and at the same time the level of poverty is rising. So currently 20% of Ukrainians are saving on food, which is quite high amount of poverty even for Ukraine. So before the war it wasn't like that. And yeah, although many people do have jobs, we have something which, I mean, in sociology we would describe it phenomenon as working poor, that people still have jobs, but it's a minimum wage and it's like 200 something euro. So still you wouldn't maintain any kind of standard of living. And yeah, the invasion has exacerbated many problems that we have before, including problems with employment, for example, barriers for many vulnerable groups that they have, barriers for women, because of the safety reasons that we have, safety problems with the bomb shelters in schools, kindergartens. Many kids cannot go to school, they're keeping at home, so that means that the women have problems, mostly women, because of the unshared division of the care labor. Women stay at home. And also, if you talk about IDPs, I mean internally displaced people, the huge amount of Ukrainians are displaced inside of Ukraine. It's currently approximately 5 million of Ukrainians who are displaced. They have also a lot of problems, but the major problems are employment and housing. Employment is a problem because a lot of people from the south and from the eastern parts of Ukraine, which were before the war quite industrialized regions, they moved to the western parts of Ukraine, in many cases to the villages, where there are some housing available but no jobs. So we have this mismatch between the labor demand and the skills that can be proposed, and people have problems with getting new jobs. And unfortunately the problems with housing are not solved since during the last 2 years that we have the full-scale war. So I wouldn't go deeply about housing policy in Ukraine, but just to give you a short important information that in the 90s we had a mass privatization of housing after the Soviet Union collapsed and we got independence. So people privatized the flats, and we were like a country of flat owners. So approximately 90% of Ukrainians before the full-scale invasion, they used to live in the flats or houses they own or their parents own. And then when people need to move to safer places in Ukraine, they need to find a new housing. And how they find this housing? There is basically 3 options. Either you live in camp-like, dormitory-like collective sites of living with a very poor conditions, also not accessible for people with disabilities, for elderly people, overcrowded, or you, let's say, try to solve your housing problems on your own. And what you do is you try to rent something on the private rental market, because in Ukraine, unfortunately, we don't have social housing as a thing. So the only option you have is the private rental market, and it's unregulated. So the tenants' rights are not protected. There is nothing that are regulated. So basically, the prices skyrocketed in the Western cities when the war started, and for many internally displaced people, it's just unaffordable because the level of salaries doesn't allow you to rent anything at all. It's a really, really low salaries, and especially for IDPs who are about to find a new job. And unfortunately, this housing crisis is something that we still have. Ukrainian state pays kind of social benefits to the internally displaced people, but they are also really small in amounts. Since the end of last year, they decided to make this payment needs tested. So this means that only the super economically disadvantaged people will get them. All the other internally displaced people, so internal refugees, they need to solve all the problems on their own. And I think it's a great problem. Besides that, I wouldn't. Also, it's a really huge problem. So I think it's a problem that that will exacerbate with the time even more. It's a problem with education because the continuity of education is now disrupted. First, because of Corona pandemic, as in every other country, 2 years in this kind of online strange format. Then the war started, another 2 years. So we have 4 years of disrupted education, and the learning losses are really high. Although Ukraine has developed really good online education in secondary school during Corona time, it's a good thing, and we keep it now. But in many parts of Ukraine, which are closer to the front line, it's hard to connect even online. And it creates problems in those parts of Ukraine where kids actually are allowed to go to school offline. If there is no shellings or basement, you cannot go there. So some kids stay at home. It's additional pressure on the parents and on the teachers. Some kids go offline, and those children and teenagers and students who went abroad when the war started, they also now have to study in 2 educational systems at the same time because they need to participate in Ukrainian education system if they would like to keep on track with our system, and then maybe to enter in Ukrainian university. But also in the countries in the Western Europe, they have the school duty. In many countries there is a school duty, and you need to go to school. So you go to 2 schools at the same time, which is really, really difficult. And of course, in this difficult situation, there are a lot of support in communities and families. But after the 2 years of the war, I think we can observe that people get exhausted, and also some of the support structures, they are, let's say, I wouldn't say they're unstable, but they have their disadvantages. Like, of course, families support each other, but if you look on the aspect of uneven division of the care work, we can see it mostly women who care about kids, about the elderly members who have been displaced with them. Also, we see the rise of domestic violence. It was like the rise was really high in the first year of the war, but it keeps rising because of all the traumatic experience that there are, and because of the combatants' experience also coming back. It doesn't work. I forgot to switch it, I think. Sorry. But still, you can hear me here. Yeah. And in general, it's really hard to keep these supporting structures together because, for example, a lot of elderly people or people with disabilities, they were dependent on the help from the neighbors and these communities they have. And then imagine that a lot of elderly people stayed in the frontline areas and in or close to frontline areas. Because of the economic problems, they cannot afford themselves to move, and then the younger part moved. So it also creates this big imbalance in support structure, because it just turned the connection between the people. And even if we talk about the internally displaced people, we can see that because of the housing crisis, in many cases, the family cannot find a flat for the whole family members. And the elderly or the family members who have severe disabilities, they will need to go to like semi-closed prison-like residential care facilities, and the younger members will rent a flat. So it just turned the families apart, and I think it's very, very problematic. Again, about housing, so it's also my research topic. So I talk about the housing. Yeah, and maybe the last thing to talk, maybe I can just hold it like that, because otherwise yeah, the other important thing is that many people really refuse to leave from the dangerous areas, and I think it's important to underline, because they don't have anyone who will support them. The situation is unclear. So many economically disadvantaged groups, they decide to stay in the zones where it's actually really dangerous, because they have this flat or this house, which is their sole financial asset that they have. I think it's important information maybe for people outside of the Ukraine. So many people don't have any savings, any bank account with savings. They just have this flat and they keep it, they try to be there. And also they survive on their gardens, their poultry, like goats and chickens, what they have. So they keep being there, and in the end, they get injured, they get killed because of the war. That's sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Tasha. It's very distressing to hear that people have to rely on informal networks. I think that makes the division, as you said, between social classes or strata even bigger, or consolidates traditional divisions. So let's dive a bit into this. Chanty or Olenka, you've done research on people who are living near the front lines. Those are a special group. How is life for them?
Thanks for this question. I should probably start by saying that as a sociologist, I do not really do research specifically on people living in the frontline areas. But I've been researching topics such as healthcare, labor, internal displacement, and also economics and logistics of the war in general. And in every research, we try to interview also people who live in frontline areas or moved from there. So it's not like I have an objective perspective and know everything that's going on there, but I can make some points. And I'll probably repeat a bit of what Dasha has said. The question I get very often is, why are they staying there? And it's been like one of the research questions posed by several NGOs I worked with. They're like, can you please interview the people and find out why the hell are they staying in those dangerous areas, because we don't understand, because we're, liberal NGOs. And like the way I would formulate this question as a sociologist is not why are they staying there, because it's kind of insensitive to ask people that, but rather what are the structural factors that prevent people from leaving these frontline areas and go somewhere safer. And it's, I think the first, the main reason which I see from my research, which is mostly in-depth interviewing, is what Dasha said, the unaffordability of housing, because basically there is no social housing and people just stay because it's the place where they have a house and they can't afford to rent elsewhere. Even though there are benefits they can receive, but it's usually not enough. to rent anything. And the second reason is limited job opportunities if they move elsewhere. There's this phenomenon that we call downward mobility. It basically means a decrease in salary or status. And yeah, I've seen a lot of this in my research, especially when people move from like bigger cities in the east to villages and small towns somewhere safer, like in Western Ukraine. And they often just can't find a job at the level they used to work at. And like, for instance, there was a woman who worked as a manager, and then when she relocated, she got employed as a shop assistant in a small town in Western Ukraine, because there just weren't any other jobs available. And I also interviewed healthcare workers who said that they're not leaving their frontline town because after many doctors have fled the town, the hospital administration has raised salaries for those who are staying in the city, which I don't think is very common, but yeah, there might be such cases that, you know, after a lot of workers leave, the employer kind of is trying to motivate them to stay by raising their salaries. And another very popular situation in terms of labor, it has to do with governmental institutions in the first place. It's very common to cut workers' salaries if they have moved elsewhere and like, continue to work online, which like practically it doesn't really make sense because they're doing the same work they used to do, just not going to the office. But employers would often use it as an excuse to like cut their salaries significantly. For example, I've talked to an accountant who's working for a city council in one town in Donetsk Oblast, whose salary before the full-scale invasion used to be around 20,000 hryvnias, which is 500 euros. And then she relocated with like her elderly parents. She moved to Western Ukraine, and now she's doing the same job, but is getting paid around 10,000 hryvnias, so like half the salary she used to have. And because her rent is also around 10,000 per month, she's also working as a cleaner on weekends to, you know, make some money to buy food, basically. Yeah, so this kind of things that have to do with salaries and like labor, they also motivate people to stay, even though in general there aren't as many job opportunities as there used to be before the invasion. And another reason why people stay is looking after sick or elderly relatives, and this is of course mostly women. And also often there are like elderly people just refusing to leave because they've spent their whole life in that house and so on. But yeah, in many cases it's just people who are like sick or have disabilities, and because of the state of their health, they can't live in those terrible conditions in shelters where, you know, often it's like a school building or something where people just like a room like this one where people just sleep on the floor, and of course you can't do that if you're old and sick. So those people stay, and their like daughters, grandchildren, they stay also to look after them. And another reason why people might be afraid to move is a fear of discrimination based on origin and language, which is kind of, I think it's not as massive as many people think. I think it's exaggerated by social media, but like it does exist. But most people I talk to about this, they've never faced it personally, or they only like faced it once. Like, someone told them that they're not welcome to like other parts of Ukraine because of where they are from. But they just see this kind of narratives a lot, and that might also be one of the reasons why they're afraid to go elsewhere. And so people who are left in these frontline areas, they obviously live in terrible conditions, constant threat to life, dying, being injured and stuff. The economic conditions are obviously bad, and I think one, well, maybe it's not that important, but it's just something I notice a lot, that people start relying on some sort of complicated economic arrangements when, for instance, they would travel to a different region for a short period of time to register as an internally displaced person there, to like receive these benefits, which are going to be cancelled soon, and then they just come back home because the benefits are not enough to rent elsewhere. So they register and they go back having these like statues and like documents that allow them to receive $50 per month. 50 bucks. Yeah, $50 per month. And that's often like the only income they have. So. And another important condition is the destruction of infrastructure, such as hospitals and schools and kindergartens, which of course disproportionately affects women, because they are being stuck with children which can't go to schools and kindergartens and have to like look after them, and because of that they often can't go to work. And sometimes it's like not even destructions, but just schools not working because of the constant danger. And I've had cases of women who, in order to go to work, they would bring their child to some sort of daycare in a shopping mall, where sometimes you have like these rooms where a child can play while you're shopping. So they would just leave the child there for like 8 hours in order to go to work because there are no kindergartens. Yeah, so I think it's gonna be it.
It was very telling and also very horrible. You mentioned that women are disproportionately affected by the effects of war. Maybe you can expand a bit more on how war affects women in particular.
Well, it seems to me that it usually has to do with motherhood. So it's mostly like women who are mothers, because men are not looking after their children. And yeah, and like in many cases, the men just went to the front line, so that's why they're not participating. Yeah, but also because my research was specifically on motherhood, because I was working with these NGOs that are trying to support Ukrainian mothers, so I specifically focused on those women who have children. So maybe that's also why I think that they have the biggest problems.
Maybe you could tell us.
And yeah, and also there are like there's also violence that Tasha has mentioned, which is increasing because of the war.
Okay. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I just recalled that there is another example I wanted to mention in many frontline cities, especially like in the Donetsk region. There is often no heating in winters because some infrastructure has been bombed and stuff, and because of that, there is such practice when people move to other areas, specifically for several months in winter, and then come back. So there's also like a lot of just moving around, which is also super exhausting. So they would go live in some shelter for like 3 or 4 months while it's cold in their flat and then come back.
Thank you very much, Alenka. Let's move to a different topic from what's happening within to what's happening outside. I think most of us, we have, if not watched in parts, heard of the interview that Tucker Carlson has conducted with Putin himself, which was really odd because basically it was just a stage for Russian propaganda. Many analysts also did say that Putin was probably aiming at us here in the West, dividing Western societies or trying to show how Russia is actually prevailing despite all Western effort. The question that we have is, do you think that, Tasha, do you think that the West is somehow susceptible to this narrative? Do you think we have blind spots? And particularly, how do people in Ukraine feel about if there is such blind spots?
Okay, maybe I can start. No, I can start. Yeah, I mean, I watched the interview also the whole 2 hours with Putin because I have fever and I can't do anything else. So, but nothing else, nothing new that was told to us. I mean, well, first 40 minutes of the interview is just history lesson, but we in Ukraine have been told these history lessons from Putin, I think, over the last 6-5 years, so it's also, and it's just prolong and prolong and prolong the lesson because he goes deeply and deeply, and I think maybe in the next interview he will start from light time with the Azaria being part of Moscow Empire, but because if you follow his ideas, and I think that these history lessons are a trap that we don't need to go into, because after he gave a new interview or a speech, or he also published, before the full-scale invasion, he published some articles on the history of Russia and Ukraine, history of Ukraine. I don't think we need to follow it. And I think one of the mistakes is that people follow it and they try to correct the mistakes. That here Putin told something wrong about the 17th century, and this like desire to correct the mistake and to find the truth, I think this is a problem. Because if we think that Putin is trying to say that there are some historic reasons for saying that Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist. And for me, I think this whole thing is problematic. I mean, if we even follow Putin's idea and agree with him that Ukraine was created by Vladimir Lenin, its artificial state was created exactly by Vladimir Lenin in 1917, 1920. The Ukrainian language doesn't exist, an artificial language, it's a mixture of Polish and Russian, okay? Everything else that he said, that in 17th century Ukraine asked Moscow to protect them from Poland, all that Putin said is complete truth. So what? Does it mean that Ukraine as a country now doesn't have a right to exist? Because I feel that when I follow it with some, I cannot say about the whole Western intellectuals, but leftist Western intellectuals, I see this like desire to find the truth, to read history, to discuss. Even we could ask sometimes like questions about the history, about collaboration in Second World War. How is it connected to the idea of Russia can invade Ukraine? I mean, I think that this is a trap, this is a big problem, because in 1990 Ukraine has declared independent. We went to the voting, to the referendum, 90% of Ukrainians voted to get to declare independence from Soviet Union. All other countries recognized us. That's all. I mean, why do we need to discuss anything that was before? Why any country need to justify itself by the historic arguments of what happened in 8th century when the Kievan Rus was baptized? I don't care how we were baptized. Why should we care about that now? Why should we discuss it? And I think, I wouldn't say that it's a bland spot, it's like, you know, in the water, you can, how you call this thing? when you swim and there is a thing in the water that trap you down. For me, it's, there is something like this there in all this desire to follow Putin's historical mess. And I don't think we need to follow it at all. I mean, okay, it's a second part. It's the first part of his interview. And maybe I would like to comment the second part. Yeah, I don't know.
I actually didn't watch the interview because I care about my mental health. It's my top priority. I mean, I read a lot on Facebook, like people retelling the interview, but yeah, what was the second part? Maybe if you retell, I can comment on that.
The second part was that Putin was trying to say that so many times Russia tried to cooperate with West, with Western countries, but Western rejected it. So that's why we have a right to do what we want, something like that. It was like a second part of justification. And in that they were discussing artificial intelligence, I think, for some reason. Or maybe you have one specific question about this.
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's fine if you take the lead. I want to know what you two have to say. But one thing that I'm wondering is, I don't even have to use this video, but the Kremlin is constantly, you could say you have constantly Putin saying that he wants to make peace, but nobody lets him. And then Medvedev says he wants to destroy everything. Yeah, and so and the West reacts to this, and there are lots of people in the West, on the left, on the right, who actually, at least to a certain extent, do believe this. And some people may be, let's say, they stop criticizing. My question is, do you in Ukraine sometimes look at the West and think, how can you be so blind?
All the time.
Yeah.
I don't know, I can add to this Medvedev-Putin combination. I don't know if you follow Medvedev, but I think you don't follow him. But the ex-president of Russia has his own Telegram channel and some other social media when he writes really like brutal things. Much more brutal than even official Russian propaganda things, real новости. And I personally see no gap between what Putin is saying and Medvedev is saying, because I think that they both kind of saying that the goal is eternal war. The goal is to prolong the situation. So Medvedev never told we will kill all Ukrainians over tomorrow. He basically wrote that yes, we will kill Ukrainians because now, I mean, his recent publications, the general idea is that all Ukrainians will die until Ukraine exists as a state, but it doesn't mean that they will kill us tomorrow, right? And what Putin is saying about this peace, which is easy to reach but hard to reach, is for me it also sounds like an eternal war. And I think that Russia is in a way just trying to prolong what is happening, and I don't know. Yes, I agree with Zelenka that there's a lot of blind spots in the Western opinion about how the conflict will be ended, and I think that for many in the West, many leftists in the West share the idea that if the peace agreements will be signed, this means that the war is over. But in reality, it's not like that, and we can see it even in the interviews with Putin, in what Medvedev writes, that it would be just some papers will be signed, that's all, but the war will be there. The war will be like a ghost in the house, because part of the country is occupied, both countries get militarized, Ukraine will be militarized, the societies will be militarized, but also Western countries will be militarized. Because it's not the end of the conflict, it's just signing some another peace agreements. And so I think here is a problem that, some Western intellectuals doesn't want to look deeply and think what will happen actually to Ukraine when the peace agreements are signed. And I think this is a big problem, this kind of formal level of discussion. And again, as I thought about the history, is this idea that when something is being told, when it's the same in the reality. We just need to find proper ways of talking about the reality, find proper definitions, call it proxy war, call it something else, call it peace. We can call it peace, but in reality it wouldn't be peace. It would be just some papers that we sign. I don't want to talk about the science fields anymore, but the general idea is like that there is a gap.
Next question.
Okay, good. Let's move on. But first of all, thank you for this really simple insight, because I think a lot of us as leftists try actually to reason and find out what is wrong. When it's so simple, if people don't want to, let them be. Good, but let's move to, well, let's stay with Russian imperialism, but let's look at it from a more practical aspect.
Yeah, thank you, Tasha and Olega, for your insights. Let's switch to the Russian occupation. The Russian occupation of Ukrainian territories is accompanied by strong Russian nationalistic rhetoric and by attempts to erase the language, religion and culture of Ukraine. Of course, the occupation is underpinned by terror, starting with the aerial war on defenseless civilians, many of them in the south and east of the country, those Russian speakers that the invaders claim to be protecting. Now about 18% of Ukrainian territory is occupied by the Russian armed forces, including the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, annexed by the Russian Federation in 2014. Then parts of Donetsk region and most of Luhansk region, controlled from 2014 by Russian-supported separatists who established unrecognized so-called People's Republics. These included most of the Donbas, coal and iron producing industrial region, and in 2014 to 17 the population is estimated to have fallen by half, mainly due to migration to other parts of Ukraine and to Russia. In February 2022, 2 days prior to the all-out invasion, these so-called republics were recognized by Russia. Also occupied are parts of Cherson, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia regions that were invaded in 2022. In September 2022, the Russian government claimed to have annexed the whole of Donetsk, Luhansk, Cherson and Zaporizhia, including the former so-called republics and areas still under Ukrainian control. Tasha, what would you tell us about how is the situation in the territories occupied since the full-scale invasion in 2022?
So I can start maybe with the topics that you mentioned. I think that one of the most important things happening there, besides the safety risks for the people, is the forced passportization. The people need to accept Russian passports and give up Ukrainian passports. The Russian passport is a must to have to get many things, including medical services, calling ambulance, social services. It's also the must to have to keep your flat or house, because what has been happening in newly occupied regions is that they start something like inventarization of housing, so they try to structure all the housing stock, who owns what, who has left, who has stayed, those who has stayed, does they have accepted Russian passports, or they keep Ukrainians. If you keep Ukrainian passport, you treated like a foreigner living in Russia, with the many consequences of it, including basically the higher taxes and the possibility of losing your home, so your ownership. Also, the movement between the settlements in the occupied area are restricted, so there are checkpoints, and you can be asked to show Russian passport. Again, if you don't have it, you won't go to the settlement. You need to go, for example, to your relatives. And this passportization also creates a problem for employment. Again, the prices went higher in the occupied region. Now, as far as we know, the situation with food, for example, medicine is better than it was in 2022. But still the prices are higher, but it's really hard to find jobs. For example, Kherson was famous for agriculture. Now a lot of fields are mined, so tourism doesn't work anymore, so it's hard to get jobs, and it's very hard to get it without passports. And the second problem is what's happening that has been already mentioned by Linke in her answers about this collaboration thing, because it's very hard to define what is collaboration and what's not collaboration in this situation. For example, with passportization, even the Ukrainian government showed different opinions. So different state officials gave different opinions about whether it's acceptable to get Russian passport or not. Our High Commissioner for Human Rights, he told that yes, it's acceptable to get Russian passport if there is danger of your life, to your health, to the health of your relatives, it's acceptable, of course you can get it. Then other state officials told not, it's not acceptable, in any case you cannot get Russian passport. And I think it creates it's a problematic attitude also from Ukrainian government. And also when people start to look for jobs, where would you get these jobs? Even if you go, I mean, you want to serve in the Russian army, but let's say you would work in something like in public services, in communal works or in schools, in hospitals. Again, there is a great danger. This would be treated as collaboration after the settlement would be released. And a friend of mine, he's covering all these court processes about collaboration in the settlements released by Ukrainian army, and we can see even about the school teachers sometimes that the teacher who is a teacher of math is clear, but the teacher who is the teacher of history or language is in danger, and there's a lot of such things. And of course, I mean, people are people, and there are cases when people just, let's say, they accuse their neighbors of collaboration, but in reality there was no cases of collaboration. So yeah, this remains a very big problem, and yeah, official position of Ukrainian government for a long time was that you don't need to accept the passport, you need to flee. You need to flee the occupied settlement, which isn't really easy. And now, without the Russian passport, it's really difficult to get out, because if you first you need to pay someone, like drivers, but it's not a guarantee you will get out. Then you need to go through this filtration procedure, so basically interrogation by the Russian soldiers and Russian security services, and only then you can be released to Ukrainian territory. And for those who can do it through Russian territory, again they can get to Russia, but then how they would get to Ukraine back? They can do it through the Baltic states, for example, but to cross the border you need to have Reisepass, like international passport, touristic passport, right? So it's very hard to get out of territories, and as Linke had said, many people decide to stay, even in the occupied territories, because of the housing problems, unclear strategies, unclear economic perspective, and the need to care about the elderly or other family members who cannot leave simply. I have been also helping to write a research report about the situation with LGBT people in occupied Kherson, and yeah, well, it's not like sociological research, but rather an observation by activists who live there. They try just to gather different experience of what's happening there, and of course their life are in great danger because also of the constant fear of being persecuted for anything, of being killed in the forest anywhere. And this is a life of it's a life for 2 years under very difficult emotional pressure also.
Thank you, Tasha. Olenka, could you say something about the Donbas region?
I think it should be not just about Donbas, but like about all the regions that went through occupation. And it's important to differentiate between the areas which had already been occupied when the full-scale invasion began, and those newly occupied. I don't really know much about the situation in the so-called People's Republic. I've had some interviews with people who fled from there, but it wasn't much. So one of the problems has to do with mobilization to the Russian army. We've interviewed people, the men who, before they escaped a town in Donetsk Oblast, they've been hiding in their flat for half a year, not living at all. And this is also linked to the gendered issues and reproductive labor women are doing, because they were only able to hide and survive because they had a partner or other female relative who would go out and bring them food, basically. So because this Russian mobilization effort was so severe that they were just grabbing people everywhere. It was very intense, so they couldn't leave at all. In other occupied territories, the ones occupied in 2022, the situation might be different. There are areas where there were terrible atrocities, and then in other regions it was mild occupation. That's what people call it. But still there were a lot of struggles. As Tasha mentioned, that people were forced to receive Russian passports. I would probably add an example from my interviews that people are reporting that they were threatened. Some guys looking like the police would come to their flat and say that if they don't get a Russian passport tomorrow, they will take their flat away. So as we already know, housing is of the highest importance because it's the only asset people have. So they would use that to threaten them. Basically, they become homeless if they don't receive a Russian passport. So there were not some abstract threats, but very direct interactions. And another issue is the difficulties of leaving the occupied territories. It also really depends. In some cases it was relatively easy. In others it wasn't. In some areas, for instance in Kharkiv Oblast, where my family is from, so my grandparents were under occupation, and and it took them around half a year before they could leave. So first they evacuated my uncle, but men younger than 60 years old, they were not allowed to leave. So my grandpa would put him in the car as a driver and say that, you know, we're evacuating, like, say that they evacuated my grandpa. And then when they got to the border, they switched, and my uncle just like ran as far as he could see, and the grandpa came back. And yeah, and later they had to leave because they had almost like no access to the medicine that they needed. So yeah, they decided to risk and like leave through Russia to the EU and then go back to Ukraine. So yeah, so it's really difficult to leave the occupied territories, even though there's also this popular idea that, you know, you can just leave, why aren't they leaving? But yeah, it's not that easy. Yeah, and about those, the so-called collaborators, I think it's, there are several thousands of cases. We don't know how many of them are real collaborations and how many are these just weird cases. Yeah, but basically people are being sentenced by the Ukrainian government as collaborators, and sometimes it's like real sentences, like several years, I think up to 15. It depends. Yeah, in some cases it's 15 years in prisons, in some it's 5 or less. In many cases it's just, I think one of the laws is that they take your property away. Like it's like a fine that you pay. They take your property. There was a case of a man who worked like as a guard in one of the occupied villages. There was basically some building where there were no windows because of the attack, and the Russians hired him to look after this building because there were like computers inside or something, so it wasn't even like a military object, maybe a school or something like that. And he was like looking after this building for $50 a month. And then when the village was deoccupied, he was sentenced as a collaborator, and because it wasn't like a very serious collaboration, he didn't go to jail, but they took his bike, like motorbike, as a fine, because it was like the only property he had, because he lived in his mother's house, which like wasn't his, so they took his bike. And there are a lot of such shameful cases. I don't know even how to call that. And the problem is that people are not getting any like legal support. The friend you mentioned, I think I know him, and yeah, I think it was him who said that there's only one lawyer in the whole Donetsk Oblast, or maybe the whole Donbass region. There's only one lawyer consulting these people for free, so they can't even seek legal advice if they don't have money, which they don't have. So, and that's why I think it's important to share this information, even though it's a little bit scary. I don't know, maybe the Ukrainian government will come after me after this. But it's very important to share this because, yeah, I think people just don't know enough about this in the West, and there, like, no Western NGO is funding any kind of like legal advice programs, which we have like a lot, but just not in this area. Yeah. Do you have 3 more minutes? I can see that you have.
It wasn't that something. Yeah, we have some more minutes.
Yeah, and just the last thing I wanted to mention is there are these so-called children of occupation. So this is also another legal issue, which I'm just really into legal issues. There are these children of occupation, the children who were those who were younger than 18 when Russia occupied parts of the eastern Ukraine in 2014. So they became adults in these People's Republics under occupation, and they were unable to receive Ukrainian passports for a variety of reasons. Sometimes, like, their parents wouldn't let them because they were like pro-Russian, because you would need to go into the Ukrainian territories to get this passport, and some people were just afraid, or their parents wouldn't let them just because they were afraid to, let them go there. And so when the full-scale invasion began, these people who are already adults, they decided to evacuate, to flee Ukraine and go to some Western countries, mostly European Union, often to Finland. And now they have absolutely no legal status there because they can't register as refugees, because you need a Ukrainian passport for that. They either don't have any passports, or they only have this passport of the so-called republics, which is not recognized, and because of that they don't have access to education, sometimes healthcare as well. So that's another problem I would like to bring up, and they keep applying filing requests to Ukrainian embassies, and they just say we can't do anything because we don't know if you're really Ukrainian, you can't prove that. And they're basically stuck in this situation where they have no legal status whatsoever, and unable to prove that they're Ukrainians, unable to go back to Ukraine, unable to become legally refugees, and just basically sitting somewhere in Finland. And some Christian organizations give them food. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we had a lot of input already, and I would suggest that we have a break now. Otherwise, you're of course welcome to add things, but we have enough time afterwards.
So the break is going to be 15 minutes. So if you could be back by 25 past, that would be like this. Somebody noticed that somebody's missing? Okay, let's wait a bit.
Okay, welcome back. So let's switch to internal Ukrainian politics. Workers' rights have been dismantled since the start of the war, and as a result of the martial law in force. And of course, the changes to the law also make the work of trade unions and leftist groups such as Solidarität more difficult. In times of war, they are taking on important social functions for their members and for the civilian population in need. Under martial law, the right to strike is practically suspended, and the opportunities for public expression of opinion and political demonstrations are severely restricted. Olenka, could you say us a bit more about the neoliberalization, the dismantling of workers' rights, the trade union rights? Do you have some concrete examples on that?
Yeah, well, there has been neoliberalization in Ukraine in basically all areas for many years, and I think at least in some areas it only increased with the beginning of the full-scale war, one of which has to do with labor rights. Our government basically is kind of attacking workers' rights. It has changed the legislation, which I think we have or had like a very good legislation on labor rights, which we kind of inherited from the Soviet Union. And this legislation has been changed in a way that allows companies to fire people much easier. And the government is justifying this as an attempt to support Ukrainian business, which is struggling because of the war. And basically, the whole governmental narrative is that we need to support the business to maybe draw in some foreign investments. And they're decreasing taxes for businesses. We have this form of business, which is like a private entrepreneur, like the form which allows people to work as a self-employed or like independent contractors and stuff. I work that way, for example. The tax for this kind of businesses is very low. It's like 5%, and it was 2% for some time during the war. And the problem is that a lot of huge businesses, corporations are registering as like dozens of these small businesses. So it really affects the economy. And going back to the attack on workers' rights, at Социальный рух we're consulting people, we have a lawyer who gives free consultations to people who are being fired illegally or have some other struggles in terms of their labor rights, like conflicts with employers. And one example would be that now, because of the war, we have a lot of soldiers seeking our support because they were fired illegally after they went to the front line. And it's also for the trade unions, I think it's more difficult to protest now because we're not allowed to have demonstrations because of the war. So I think it's like the main change for the trade unions, that they can't organize like any strikes legally.
yeah, maybe Tasha can tell more about the situation on the ground.
I can add something to it.
I think, now I hear myself, I think I can add something maybe more about the local level, because you can read some articles about these neoliberal changes in the labor law, at least in the English-speaking media sometimes, but I think the whole austerity measures that we have in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they're also happening not on the level of national policies, but they're happening also in the everyday policy and political practice in the communities on the local level. Because as we have been, we have started, I think, our discussion about unemployment problems, how the war hit economy, and the war really hit economy indeed, because a lot of factories and enterprises have been physically destroyed, and chains of production have been ruined. So this economic downfall is really huge, and it was really huge in the first year of the war. And this means that the budget revenues have also decreased significantly, and it remains the same in the second year of the war also. And this means basically that the pie that should be divided, that this budget that should be redistributed, is also became smaller and smaller, and somehow I wouldn't say that neoliberal policies are justified, but some sort of austerity measures, they kind of justified by the reality, or some sort of cuttings are justified on the local level. So when you talk about local level, I will just say a few words about Ukrainian territorial administrative structure. One of the most comprehensive reforms that we have in the recent decade was the reform of territorial administrative structure. We call it decentralization reform. So the idea of this reform is that municipalities, and actually we call it hromada, which meaning of hromada is basically Gemeinde, has the same meaning. And hromadas, they get more responsibilities in many spheres, like social protection, education, healthcare, and also the bigger share of taxes stayed at the local level and not go to the state budget. So the idea was great that taxes stayed and each community can decide for themselves what kind of strategic developments they would like to have. They can have more freedom in economic development, for example. So the idea was great, and actually a lot of experts claim that this reform was the most successful reform of the Maidan reform that we have after 2014. But also other experts, and I would say I'm in this camp, tell that a lot of economic disparities between the regions and communities have been exacerbated because of this situation, because this uneven development of the countries that we used to have. It exacerbated, so poorer communities became poorer, and it's very hard for them to solve their social problems, for example. So this is something we had before the war. Now the war started, and the budget revenue falls everywhere in the country, but again, some communities were influenced by the war more significantly, by the shellings or by the mass displacement. And if you think about the local planning of each community, let's say it would be 10 villages or 15 cities, it wasn't prepared for this mass dislocation of people and the downfall of the budgets. So what I see from also my research, which I do conduct on the level of communities, that many local authorities, they are made to decide how they will distribute this really small pie of money. So what they will do, they will invest in social services, or they will spend some money on the roof in the school, or they will build these collective sites for internally displaced people. And these are very hard decisions. Sometimes they're also political decisions, so basically they would also, what I get at least from the interview, that they would also sometimes think twice where to invest this small amount of money, and this is how this austerity in practice is happening, just because they need to survive and they need to do something with this money. And I think that this is a great problem which will continue, and this gap between the situation in different parts of the country, different communities, it will only grow. And also, one thing about the budget revenues that we have is that in the autumn, we also have been a lot of debates on the national level about how we should finance the military expenditures, because we need more and more money and we get less and less help from the West. So one of the ideas was that the income tax of the military personnel, which before was divided in half, and a bigger part of it went to the local budget of this person, of his or her region. And then in the autumn there have been also public protests, and there have been a lot of debates on the national level in order to redistribute this income tax differently. So that basically the tax of the salaries of the military will go only to the state budget, and this money will be spent on the military purposes. So there was a big debate, there were a lot of protests, and the idea behind this was that, well, now the military expenditures is the most crucial thing that we need to have, because we need to finance the defense purposes. We don't need to finance social services in communities, or, I don't know, education or something else. We need to put the money to the war. So they changed the law, and now these taxes are also going to the state budget. So the pie became even smaller. And this situation is very, very problematic on the local level, because, as you can imagine, other support structure rather than family are the public services, public workers, these local authorities really on the low level. They get more and more work because of all the social consequences of the war, but there is less and less money to pay them salaries, for example. So this process looks like, you know, like a snowball which is rolling from the mountain. It's very hard to stop it. And it's not only the whole national debate about how neoliberal Ukraine should be, but it's also happening on the local level. And I think that, of course, a lot of neoliberal reforms which we can observe in Ukraine, they are also imposed on us by the loans conditions and the IMF and other institutions, but also these reforms that try to justify themselves in the social conditions, in the economic conditions, saying yes, we need to make these payments to internally displaced people means tested, because we don't have money to pay to everyone anymore. So this is a very complicated process. I think it's important to underline, especially here in this audience, because I have been also heard a lot in other events that Ukraine is so neoliberal country, so why we should support it. But the process is more comprehensive. I think what lacks in this debate about policies and measures that can be done in Ukraine is that how we can make the pie bigger that we divide. And unfortunately, these discussions haven't been present in Ukraine since the war started. As Lenka has said, we decreased the income taxes for the business, for self-employed people, which sounds could sound a bit illogical, right? Because maybe we would like to have more budget revenues and less budget revenues. So, but instead we took other decisions, and I think that there is a lack of discussions about introducing other measures to increase the pie and not to go too far with these austerity policies. In the beginning of this year, just to add these positive things, in the beginning of this year, actually, there have been already ideas from the government that we should introduce some sort of progressive taxation, and that the self-employed people should pay bigger taxes. But I think it's also these ideas, they came from the state of desperateness, because we still need to get this money somewhere. But also, I personally think it's a bit it's not too late, but it's late. We spent 2 years in the war without a proper war economy. Yeah. So this is it. Neoliberal policy is just on the top, but the whole economic situation is really comprehensive.
Perhaps one last question to you both. How can groups like Solidarität intervene in this situation? What are you doing? What are you trying to do to help the people?
I think an important disclaimer to make is that even though Solidarität is like the biggest socialist, openly socialist organization in Ukraine, we're just around 80 people, plus maybe dozens of people who are not officially members but are supporting us. So we're really a small group of activists. Yeah, and basically with the beginning of the full-scale war, as many other similar leftist initiatives, we switched part of our activity to humanitarian as well as military support, spending resources and our time collecting money to support our comrades who are at the front lines and so on. So that's a big part of our activity these days. Yeah, and I would say that even though our aim as an organization is to become a socialist, a workers' party eventually, but it's something we won't be able to do in the nearest future. So we're basically functioning as an NGO right now, receiving our first ever grant from some Western organizations. Yeah, so I think what we can do, considering our resources, is supporting people as much as we can with their labor struggles, supporting trade unions. We've got several trade unions that we work with on a regular basis, such as construction workers, healthcare workers, and railway workers. So those are the unions that we're constantly working with, providing them legal support and organizing some sorts of educational events for them. Yeah, so that's basically the main thing. Would you like to add something?
Yes, that would talk too long. Let's maybe proceed with other questions.
So is it yes or no?
No.
Okay.
Okay, then I think I should pass over to Jan, and you can do the final
Talk to mine. Good. Yeah, that was again very interesting, very deep insight. So let's conclude what you two have to say, and then let's give everyone here the opportunity to ask you questions. I think this is what we would say in German. Juckt uns unter den Fingernägeln. So, sorry. The last question would be, did you have a last word? Do you have, let's put it like this, how can the West, well, countries, people, collective West on the one hand, and how can specifically the left in the West support Ukraine? Maybe on a high level, but maybe also on a low level, personally.
Maybe I can start. I think that one of the most important things for me personally, what I'm trying to reach in some events in which I participate, is to make Western leftists be interested in learning about how life looks like in Ukraine right now, and especially in these occupied areas and the areas close to hostilities, because I think this, knowing the concrete social reality will make people think differently about these possible peace agreements and supporting or not supporting the frozen conflict or reaching the peace in any, like, just to sign something. Because I think if you learn and you educate yourself about something, you can have more informed conclusions, and you can understand that maybe signing something for signing something wouldn't help anyone. So I think, yeah, one of my expectations is to learn something about social reality in Ukraine, and the second thing is really engaging. Maybe like I would like to see trade unions and left groups in the Western countries be more active in terms of getting in touch with Ukrainian refugees. Maybe not in terms of humanitarian assistance, but in terms of labor rights. Because in many European countries now, Ukrainian refugees are getting to the labor market. They're pushed there by reduced social benefits. In some countries, they don't get any social benefits from the government at all. And usually they get into really complicated employment situations, because it's either low-skilled jobs, like informal employment. They're not, in many cases, Ukrainians are not informed about the labor rights in the country that they have, and they ended up in really complicated life situations, often being surrounded by Ukrainian migrant diaspora from the previous generation, who sometimes would also look on the labor exploitation from the different perspectives, that yes, it's what you get when you get into Western country, it's like, it's a life is like that. And they also have lack of information about how they can protect their labor rights or their social rights. And I think it's a sphere in which left groups can be more active, because then again you have a real contact with the real people and you know better the real social circumstances. I think it's very important, because if you engage yourself into the real social actions, you do not spend so much time about this history debates, or this intellectual debates about defining something as a proxy war or some other war. You have a real contact with real people, and you do these real steps to make their life better. Yeah, so my expectations right now, after 2 years of the war, are really maybe low, but I think that the practical side is more important than, I don't know, some manifestos or something like that. And maybe the last thing, which is also kind of is not something which is on the table right now, and we need to, and I expect Western leftist organization to engage in this with like really significantly, but I think it's an important topic. It's the reconstruction of Ukraine. Because Ukrainian activists from all sorts of political dimensions, they're really engaged into the recovery debates, and we follow the recovery plans, we criticize it, we try to say our word, how the future Ukraine should look like. So I think what would be nice to get from our Western comrades is to be interested at least a bit in that, and maybe follow your own country, what kind of investors from your country would come to Ukraine, how they treat workers in Switzerland, how they would treat workers in Ukraine then. Because sometimes we just lack this, the full picture. In Ukraine we just get information that some cool investors, they will come, they will rebuild this, they will create workplaces. Maybe we don't need these workplaces if they will be of poor quality. So I think it's some small practical things which could be done, which could be a great help for us.
Yeah, I would probably just add briefly, like at this so-called higher level,
if the Western left could like influence their governments to not support Russia and trade with Russia that much, and by that I mean some sort of hidden connections, you know, when what the government presents is all these sort of sanctions against Russia, they're adding new sanctions again and again, but then in reality Russian capital is still there. It's like in offshores in Western countries, and Russian oligarchs investing their capital into mansions in London and stuff like that, and like shares of European companies in some oil and gas companies in Russian. So all sorts of that hidden connections, which we don't really see until we start looking for them on purpose. Yeah, I think it's another thing the activists in these countries could look into. Because even in Ukraine we have this public image of the West being supportive, constantly supporting Ukraine, but in reality there are still these massive connections with Russian business.
Thank you both very much. Very interesting. Well, but true leftists, we shouldn't only engage in manifestos, but also get in touch with refugees here. And also a good call, because I think Switzerland is one of the big complicit nations. We have dealt up to 60% of Russian oil, and we have imposed sanctions now, but we have just found new ways with our very intransparent network of financial systems to circumvent them. So Switzerland is a big complicit asshole of Russia. But good, I would like to open this so you can ask Tasha and Alenka your questions. I'd say that